The auction ended. Only the untamable alien girl remained. The auction hall buzzed with the electric tension of completed transactions. Wealthy buyers from across the galaxy had claimed their prizes: exotic pets, rare artifacts, and living curiosities from the outer rim worlds. The massive chamber, carved from asteroid rock and polished to an obsidian shine, now held only scattered groups of satisfied customers finalizing their purchases. Marcus Reed stood at the back of the hall, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the scene. The human trader had attended dozens of these auctions over the years, but something about today felt different. The usual excitement of acquisition had been replaced by a growing unease that settled in his chest like a cold stone. At the center of the stage, a single containment field still hummed with energy. Inside, a figure sat motionless on the metal floor, knees drawn up to her chest. The auction master, a tall Vorthan with silver, scaled skin, gestured dismissively toward the remaining lot. Lot 847 remains unclaimed, the auction master announced, his voice carrying the practiced indifference of someone who had seen too many failed sales. The reserve price was not met. Standard protocol dictates return to holding facility pending next quarter's auction. Marcus moved closer, his boots echoing against the polished floor. The girl, for she appeared young by any species standards, raised her head slightly at his approach. Her skin held an ethereal blue-green hue that seemed to shift like water in moonlight, and her eyes were pools of liquid silver that reflected the harsh auction lights. Delicate gills fluttered along her neck, and her hair moved as if underwater despite the dry atmosphere. "What's her story?" Marcus asked the auction master, who was already directing workers to prepare the containment field for transport. The Vorthan's expression soured. Aquatic species from the Kepler system, highly intelligent but completely uncooperative. 3 previous owners returned her within standard warranty periods. Damaged 2 transport vessels during capture attempts. The holding facility reports she refuses all forms of conditioning. Marcus studied the girl more carefully. Her posture spoke of defiance rather than defeat. Even contained within the energy field, she carried herself with a dignity that the auction process had failed to break. When their eyes met, he saw no plea for rescue, only a fierce independence that reminded him of the wild storms on his home world. "What was the reserve price?" he asked quietly. 50,000 credits. The auction master replied, already losing interest. Frankly, even that was optimistic. She's proven to be more trouble than she's worth. The other buyers were filing out now, their purchases secured, and their attention already turning to the next opportunity. Marcus watched them go, these collectors of the rare and unusual, who saw living beings as objects to be owned and displayed. His own ship's cargo hold contained legitimate trade goods, rare minerals, technological components, and cultural artifacts acquired through proper channels. He had never purchased a sentient being before. The very concept violated every principle he held dear about personal freedom and dignity. Yet something about this girl's situation struck him as fundamentally wrong. She wasn't merchandise to be sold to the highest bidder. She was a person, trapped in a system that refused to acknowledge her personhood. "I'll take her," Marcus said, the words emerging before he fully realized he had spoken them. The auction master turned back with surprise. "The full reserve price? 50,000 credits, yes." The girl's silver eyes fixed on him with an intensity that made Marcus feel as though she was looking directly into his soul. He couldn't read her expression, but he sensed a shift in her posture, a subtle tension that suggested she was evaluating this new development. As the transaction processed, Marcus approached the containment field. The girl remained motionless, but her gills fluttered more rapidly, and her hair seemed to move with increased agitation. Up close, he could see the intricate patterns that decorated her skin, not tattoos, but natural markings that resembled flowing water or wind patterns. "My name is Marcus," he said softly, knowing she might not understand his words but hoping his tone would convey his intent. "I'm going to get you out of here." The auction master completed the payment processing and began powering down the containment field. As the energy barrier dissolved, the girl remained exactly where she was, watching Marcus with those unsettling silver eyes. She made no move to flee or attack, but her entire body radiated a coiled readiness. "The transport collar is mandatory," the auction master explained, producing a metal device that resembled a necklace. "Standard safety protocol for all purchases. It will prevent any difficulties during transport." Marcus took the collar but didn't immediately approach the girl. Instead, he studied her face, trying to understand what she was thinking. The device felt heavy in his hands, and he could see the small control mechanisms that would allow him to restrict her movements or even render her unconscious if necessary. "She understands more than she lets on," he murmured to himself. The girl's head tilted slightly at his words, confirming his suspicion. Her silver eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Marcus saw something that might have been curiosity mixed with the defiance. The auction master grew impatient. "Sir, I must insist on proper restraint protocols. This particular specimen has a history of violent resistance." Marcus looked at the collar in his hands, then at the girl who waited to see what he would do. The weight of the moment settled on him like a physical force. Whatever decision he made now would determine not just how he transported her to his ship, but how their entire relationship would begin. He had purchased her freedom, but that freedom would be meaningless if he simply became another captor in a long line of those who had tried to break her spirit. The girl seemed to sense his internal struggle, her silver eyes never leaving his face as he weighed his options. The auction hall had emptied except for the cleanup crew and a few lingering officials. Soon, they would be alone with his decision and its consequences. Marcus had faced many difficult choices in his years as a trader, but none had felt as crucial as this moment. Marcus weighed the collar in his hands, feeling its cold metal against his palms. The girl watched him with those penetrating silver eyes, and he could sense the tension radiating from her small frame. Every instinct told him that placing the restraint device around her neck would be the first step toward becoming exactly the type of person he despised, another captor who saw her as property rather than a person. "No," he said finally, setting the collar aside. "I won't use that." The auction master's scaled features contorted with alarm. "Sir, I must strongly advise against. She's not a wild animal." Marcus interrupted. "She's a person. I'll treat her as such." The girl's head tilted again, and Marcus caught what might have been surprise flickering across her features. She unfolded herself slowly, rising to her full height. She was smaller than he had expected. The top of her head barely reached his shoulder, but there was nothing diminutive about her presence. She moved with a fluid grace that reminded him of dancers he had seen on the waterworlds. Marcus stepped back, giving her space to leave the platform. For a moment she didn't move at all, simply studying him with those unsettling eyes. Then, with deliberate slowness, she stepped forward. Her bare feet made no sound against the polished floor, and her movements carried an otherworldly quality that made the auction hall's harsh lighting seem somehow softer. "Can you understand me?" Marcus asked gently. The girl's lips parted slightly, revealing teeth that were perfectly white but slightly pointed. She made no sound, but her eyes flickered toward the auction master and then back to Marcus. The message was clear. She understood but wouldn't speak in front of others. "My ship is docked in Bay 94, Marcus continued. "Will you come with me?" After a long moment, the girl nodded once. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of a decision freely made. Marcus felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. This was the first voluntary cooperation she had shown anyone in the auction house's records. They walked together toward the exit, the girl maintaining a careful distance of about 3 feet. Marcus noticed that she moved with constant awareness of her surroundings, her silver eyes cataloging every person they passed and every potential exit. Her gills fluttered more rapidly when they encountered groups of other beings, but she never showed fear, only heightened alertness. The corridor leading to the docking bays was utilitarian and harsh, lit by strips of cold white light. Other purchasers moved past them with their own acquisitions, some in cages, others in stasis containers, and a few led by various forms of restraint. The girl's eyes tracked each group they passed, and Marcus saw her jaw tighten when they encountered a particularly distressing sight. A group of small, furry creatures huddled together in a transparent container. "I know," Marcus said quietly. "I don't like it either." The girl's gaze snapped to him, and for the first time he saw something other than wariness in her expression. There was a depth of understanding there that suggested she had grasped not just his words, but the sentiment behind them. They reached the docking bay without incident. Marcus's ship, the Meridian, was a mid-sized cargo vessel that had served him well for over a decade. Its hull bore the scars of countless journeys, but the engines were well maintained, and the living quarters were comfortable. As they approached the boarding ramp, the girl stopped walking. Marcus turned to face her. "This is my ship. I know you have no reason to trust me, but I give you my word that I won't harm you." She studied the ship with those penetrating silver eyes, then looked at him for a long moment. Whatever she saw in his expression seemed to satisfy her, because she nodded again and followed him up the ramp. The ship's interior was functional but warm, with real wood paneling in the common areas and soft lighting that was far more pleasant than the harsh fluorescence of the auction house. The girl's posture relaxed slightly as they moved through the corridors, and Marcus caught her running her fingers along the wood grain of the walls. "Are you hungry?" he asked as they entered the main common area. "Thirsty?" The girl's gills fluttered, and she touched her throat with one delicate hand. Marcus realized that her aquatic nature meant she might need more than just water to drink. She might need to immerse herself completely. "Let me show you the refresher," he said, leading her to a small chamber that included both a standard hygiene station and a deep soaking tub. The water recycling system can adjust the mineral content and temperature. Will that work for you? The girl examined the facilities with obvious interest. She turned a few controls experimentally, and Marcus was impressed by how quickly she seemed to understand the system. When she looked at him again, there was something that might have been gratitude in her silver eyes. "I'll leave you to get settled," Marcus said, backing toward the door. "When you're ready, I'll be in the main cabin. We should talk about what happens next." As he prepared to leave, the girl made her first sound, a soft musical tone that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her chest. It wasn't quite singing, but it wasn't speech either. The sound held a quality that made Marcus think of flowing water and distant oceans. "You're welcome," he said, somehow understanding that the sound had been an expression of thanks. He closed the door behind him and made his way to the ship's bridge. As he began the departure sequence, Marcus found himself wondering what he had gotten himself into. He had acted on impulse, driven by a sense of moral obligation, but now he faced the reality of harboring what was technically stolen property, if a person could be considered property at all. The girl had been catalogued as merchandise, sold at auction, and transferred to his ownership according to the legal frameworks of this sector. But Marcus had never felt comfortable with the concept of owning another sentient being, and everything about her behavior suggested intelligence and self-awareness that made the entire transaction feel like a crime. As the Meridian lifted off from the asteroid station, Marcus made a decision that would define everything that followed. He would not treat her as property. He would not try to break her spirit or force her into compliance. Instead, he would find a way to give her the one thing she had never truly possessed: genuine freedom. The ship's engines hummed to life, carrying them away from the auction house and toward an uncertain future. Behind him, Marcus could hear the sound of running water and something that might have been singing. For the first time since entering the auction hall, he felt like he had made the right choice. The next several days aboard, the Meridian established a delicate routine between Marcus and his unusual passenger. She had claimed the refresher as her primary living space, spending hours submerged in the large tub with the water cycling continuously. Marcus modified the ship's systems to accommodate her needs, adjusting mineral content and temperature controls to match what he guessed might be similar to her home world's oceans. Communication remained a challenge. The girl, Marcus had begun thinking of her as Kira, though he hadn't asked if she had a name, seemed to understand standard galactic common perfectly well, but she rarely spoke aloud. Instead, she had developed a complex system of gestures and expressions that Marcus was slowly learning to interpret. She was curious about everything. Marcus would often find her examining the ship's systems with those penetrating silver eyes, her webbed fingers tracing the flow of cables and conduits, as if she could understand their purpose through touch alone. Her intelligence was undeniable. She had figured out how to operate the food synthesizer within hours, and had even managed to modify it to create something that resembled the algae-based nutrition her species required. "You're an engineer," Marcus observed one morning as he found her studying the ship's navigation computer. "Or at least you understand technology." Kira looked up at him, her silver eyes reflecting the soft blue glow of the computer screens. She made a gesture with her hands that seemed to indicate complexity, fingers weaving together in an intricate pattern that suggested deep understanding of interconnected systems. "Your people built things," Marcus continued, settling into the chair beside her. "Ships, cities." Her expression grew distant, and she touched the screen displaying star charts with one finger. She pointed to a sector that Marcus recognized as the Kepler system, then made a sweeping gesture that encompassed the entire display. Whatever her people had built, it had been vast. What happened to them? Marcus asked gently. Kira's demeanor changed instantly. Her gills fluttered rapidly, and her silver eyes filled with something that could only be described as pain. She turned away from the navigation display and made a sharp cutting gesture with her hand, a clear indication that she didn't want to discuss the subject. Marcus respected her silence, but the interaction left him with more questions than answers. The official records from the auction house had been deliberately vague about her origins, listing only that she was from an aquatic species and had been salvaged from a derelict vessel. The term "salvaged" suggested she had been the sole survivor of some catastrophe. Their days fell into a comfortable pattern. Marcus handled the ship's operations and maintained course toward the outer rim, where he had legitimate business to conduct. Kira explored every inch of the vessel, her curiosity apparently insatiable. She seemed particularly fascinated by the ship's gardens, a small hydroponics bay where Marcus grew fresh vegetables for long journeys. It was in the garden that their first real breakthrough occurred. Marcus was tending to the tomato plants when he heard that musical sound again, the deep, resonant tone that seemed to come from somewhere in Kira's chest. He looked up to find her standing beside a flowering vine, her fingers gently touching the delicate blossoms. "They're beautiful," he said, moving to stand beside her. Kira made the musical sound again, and this time Marcus realized it wasn't random. The tone changed subtly, rising and falling in a pattern that seemed to correspond to the visual rhythm of the flowers. She was describing what she saw, but in a language that used music rather than words. "Your people communicated through song," Marcus said, understanding flooding through him. Kira nodded, and for the first time since leaving the auction house, she smiled. The expression transformed her face completely, replacing the guarded wariness with something radiant and alive. She began to sing not the simple tones she had made before, but a complex melody that painted pictures in Marcus's mind. He couldn't understand the words, but he could feel the emotions behind them. Joy, loss, hope, and something that might have been homesickness all wove together in a tapestry of sound that brought tears to his eyes. When she finished, the garden seemed somehow quieter, as if the plants themselves had been listening. "That was incredible," Marcus said softly. Kira's smile faded slightly, and she gestured toward the stars visible through the garden's transparent ceiling. Her meaning was clear. She had sung of home, of people and places that no longer existed. "I'm sorry," Marcus said. "I wish I could help you find them." She shook her head sadly, then did something unexpected. She reached out and touched his arm gently, her webbed fingers warm against his skin. The gesture was clearly meant to comfort him, a reversal of roles that spoke to the depth of her empathy. Over the following days, their relationship began to shift. Kira started spending more time in the common areas, often sitting quietly while Marcus worked on ship maintenance or reviewed trade documents. She seemed to enjoy watching him work, her silver eyes following his movements with keen interest. She also began to vocalize more, though not in standard galactic common. Instead, she would hum or sing softly while moving through the ship, her musical voice creating an almost ethereal atmosphere. Marcus found himself looking forward to these moments, when the mechanical sounds of the ship's systems were overlaid with her haunting melodies. The real change came when they encountered a problem with the ship's environmental systems. A coolant leak had triggered multiple warnings, and Marcus was struggling to locate the source of the problem. The diagnostic systems were giving conflicting readings, and manual inspection of the affected areas was proving difficult. Kira peered at his shoulder as he worked, her silver eyes studying the readouts with obvious understanding. She made a series of gestures, pointing to different displays, and then toward a section of the ship that Marcus hadn't considered. When he looked puzzled, she sighed a sound like wind through water, and moved to the maintenance access panel. Her smaller size and flexible joints allowed her to navigate the cramped spaces with ease. Within minutes, she had located the actual source of the leak, a fracture in a secondary coolant line that the ship's sensors had missed. She emerged from the access tunnel with blue-green coolant staining her skin and a satisfied expression on her face. "How did you know?" Marcus asked as they worked together to repair the damaged line. Kira tapped her temple, then made a flowing gesture with her hands. She could hear the ship's systems in a way that Marcus couldn't. The subtle changes in vibration and resonance that indicated problems before they became critical failures. Her people, it seemed, had been natural engineers, capable of understanding complex systems through senses that humans didn't possess. The repair work created a new dynamic between them. Marcus found himself relying on her insights more frequently, and she seemed to take pleasure in being useful. They developed a working relationship that transcended the language barrier, communicating through gestures, expressions, and the occasional musical phrase from Kira. As their destination approached, Marcus faced a difficult decision. His original plan had been to find a way to free her safely, perhaps on one of the outer rim worlds where her unusual appearance wouldn't attract unwanted attention. But their time together had revealed the depth of her intelligence and capabilities, and he was beginning to realize that she might not want to be simply abandoned on some distant planet. The question of what she wanted became more pressing as they prepared to dock at Freeport Station, a rough and tumble trading post that served as Marcus's primary base of operations. He had business to conduct there, relationships to maintain, and a reputation to consider. Bringing an obviously non-human companion into that environment would raise questions he wasn't sure he was ready to answer. "We'll be docking soon," Marcus told her as they sat in the common area sharing a meal. "I need to handle some business on the station. What do you want to do?" Kira's expression grew thoughtful. She gestured toward the viewport, where the lights of Freeport Station were becoming visible, then back to herself. Her meaning was clear. She wanted to come with him. It might be dangerous, Marcus warned. People there don't always react well to differences. Kira's silver eyes flashed with something that might have been amusement. She made a gesture that clearly indicated she was capable of handling herself, then added a musical phrase that sounded distinctly challenging. Marcus got the impression that she was more concerned about his safety than her own. As the Meridian approached its docking berth, Marcus realized that their journey together was entering a new phase. What had begun as a rescue mission was evolving into something more complex, a partnership built on mutual respect and understanding. He still didn't know what the future held for either of them, but he was beginning to suspect that their paths were now permanently intertwined. The docking clamps engaged with a solid thunk, and the ship's systems began their shutdown sequence. Marcus looked at Kira, who was watching the station's lights with obvious interest. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Freeport Station lived up to its reputation as a haven for traders, smugglers, and anyone else who preferred to conduct business away from the prying eyes of official authorities. The massive structure had been built inside a hollowed-out asteroid, its interior a maze of corridors, marketplaces, and entertainment districts that never truly slept. The air carried the scent of exotic spices, recycled atmosphere, and the subtle undertone of desperation that seemed to permeate all frontier stations. Marcus had spent the better part of the morning preparing Kira for what they might encounter. He had provided her with a hooded cloak that would conceal her more obviously non-human features, though her graceful movements and the subtle shimmer of her skin would still mark her as different to anyone who looked closely. "Stay close to me," he advised as they prepared to disembark. Freeport has its own rules, and not all of them are written down. Kira nodded, adjusting the hood to shadow her silver eyes. She had been unusually quiet during the docking procedure, and Marcus sensed a tension in her that hadn't been there before. Whether it was anticipation or anxiety, he couldn't tell. They made their way through the station's corridors, moving with the confident stride of regular visitors. Marcus had established relationships here over many years, and his reputation as a fair dealer had earned him a certain level of respect. The fact that he was accompanied by a cloaked figure barely drew attention in a place where anonymity was often a matter of survival. Their first stop was the office of Victor Reeves, a gruff administrator who handled Marcus's regular shipping manifests and cargo permits. The man looked up from his desk as they entered, his weathered face creasing into a welcoming smile. "Marcus, good to see you back," Victor said, rising to clasp Marcus's hand. "I heard there was some excitement at the Vega auction house. Lot of hive, Al. You items changing hands." "Nothing that would interest me," Marcus replied casually. "I stick to legitimate goods." Victor's eyes flicked to Kira, who stood silently beside Marcus with her hood pulled low. "Friend of yours, a traveling companion," Marcus said carefully. "She's interested in seeing how frontier trade operates." The administrator seemed to accept this explanation without question. In a place like Freeport, people's backgrounds were rarely discussed openly. Victor processed Marcus's paperwork efficiently, and they completed their business within an hour. As they left the office, Marcus noticed that Kira had been studying everything with intense interest. Her hidden eyes had tracked every conversation, every gesture, every detail of the transaction. When they were alone in the corridor, she made a series of quick gestures that Marcus interpreted as questions about the administrative process. "It's all about relationships," he explained quietly. "Victor trusts me because I've dealt honestly with him for years. That trust is worth more than any amount of credits." Kira nodded thoughtfully, then made a gesture that seemed to indicate she understood the concept of reputation-based commerce. Her people, Marcus realized, had probably operated under similar principles. Their next destination was the parts market, where Marcus needed to acquire replacement components for the Meridian's aging systems. The market was a chaotic maze of booths and stalls, each offering everything from military-grade weapons to exotic foodstuffs. The crowds were thick, and the noise level was overwhelming. Marcus had been negotiating with a Centauri merchant for a new navigation processor when he noticed that Kira was no longer beside him. He looked around quickly, scanning the crowd for her distinctive silhouette. A moment of panic gripped him as he realized she had vanished into the throng of shoppers and traders. He excused himself from the negotiation and began searching the nearby stalls. The market was a labyrinth, and it would be easy for someone unfamiliar with the layout to become lost. Marcus's concern deepened as he considered how the station's less savory residents might react to discovering an obviously non-human woman wandering alone. He found her 3 levels down, in a section of the market that specialized in salvage technology. She was standing before a stall that displayed an array of crystalline components, her hood pushed back and her silver eyes reflecting the soft light emanating from the crystals. The merchant, a thin human woman with cybernetic implants, was watching her with obvious fascination. "These are Aquarian," the merchant was saying. "Very rare. The whole civilization vanished about 5 years ago. Some kind of plague or environmental catastrophe. These crystals are about all that's left of their technology." Marcus approached quietly, his heart sinking as he saw the pain in Kira's expression. She was holding one of the crystals, and Marcus could see her hands trembling slightly. The musical tone she made was so soft it was barely audible, but it carried a depth of grief that made his chest tight. "How much?" Marcus asked the merchant. "For the whole collection, 50,000 credits," the woman replied. "These aren't just decorative. They're memory crystals, part of their data storage systems. Could be worth 10 times that to the right collector." Marcus looked at Kira, who was clutching the crystal to her chest. Her silver eyes met his, and he saw a desperate hope there that broke his heart. These weren't just technological artifacts. They were pieces of her lost civilization, possibly the only remaining fragments of her people's knowledge and culture. "I'll take them," Marcus said without hesitation. The merchant's eyes widened in surprise. "All of them, that's a significant purchase. All of them." Marcus confirmed, transferring the credits from his account. As the merchant began carefully packaging the crystals, Kira moved to Marcus's side. She touched his arm gently, then made a complex series of gestures that clearly expressed gratitude beyond words. The musical tone she produced was beautiful and heartbreaking, a song of thanks that resonated through the busy marketplace. They completed the purchase in silence, with Kira carefully examining each crystal as it was packaged. Marcus could see her memorizing every detail as if she were greeting old friends. When they were finished, she carried the collection like precious cargo. Their return journey to the ship was subdued. Marcus had spent a significant portion of his savings on the crystals, but he felt no regret. The look of hope in Kira's eyes was worth far more than the credits he had paid. Back aboard the Meridian, Kira immediately took the crystals to her quarters. Marcus could hear her singing softly as she worked, her voice carrying through the ship's corridors like a lullaby. When he checked on her later, he found her sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by the glowing crystals arranged in a complex pattern. "Can you read them?" he asked softly. Kira looked up at him, her silver eyes bright with excitement. She nodded enthusiastically, then gestured toward the crystals. Her next musical phrase was different from any he had heard before, more complex, layered with harmonics that seemed to make the crystals pulse with brighter light. Marcus realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. The crystals weren't just storage devices, they were interactive, responding to Kira's voice in ways that suggested a technology far beyond anything he had encountered. As she sang, images began to form in the air above the crystals, holographic projections of underwater cities, strange machines, and people who looked like Kira. "Your people," Marcus breathed. Kira nodded, tears streaming down her face as the images continued to flow. The holograms showed a civilization of incredible beauty and sophistication, with technology that seemed to blend seamlessly with nature. Cities that grew like coral reefs, vehicles that moved like living creatures, and art that existed in dimensions of sound and light that human senses could barely perceive. But the images also showed destruction. Marcus watched in horror as the beautiful cities were consumed by darkness, their inhabitants fleeing in ships that looked more like living beings than mechanical constructs. The final images showed empty oceans, dead cities, and the slow dissolution of everything Kira's people had built. When the display finally ended, Kira was sobbing quietly. Marcus sat beside her, unsure how to offer comfort for a loss so profound. Eventually, she leaned against him, and they sat together in the soft glow of the crystals, sharing a grief that transcended species boundaries. "I'm sorry," Marcus said quietly. "I can't imagine what that must have been like." Kira made a soft musical sound, then gestured toward the crystals. Her meaning was clear. She was the keeper of her people's memory now, the sole guardian of their knowledge and culture. The responsibility was enormous, but she seemed determined to bear it. Over the following days, Marcus watched as Kira worked with the crystals, learning to access their stored information and beginning what appeared to be a massive project of cataloging and preservation. She had found her purpose, and it gave her a strength and determination that Marcus found both inspiring and humbling. As the Meridian prepared to leave Freeport Station, Marcus realized that their relationship had evolved once again. He was no longer just her rescuer or her host. He was her partner in a mission that might be the most important work either of them would ever undertake. Together, they would ensure that the knowledge and beauty of her people would not be forgotten. The ship's engines hummed to life, carrying them toward their next destination and whatever challenges awaited them. Behind them, the crystals pulsed with gentle light, holding the dreams and memories of a lost civilization in their crystalline hearts. The weeks that followed their departure from Freeport Station established a new rhythm aboard the Meridian. Marcus handled the ship's operations and his legitimate trading business, while Kira devoted herself to working with the memory crystals. She had transformed her quarters into a combination workshop and shrine, with the crystals arranged in complex patterns that seemed to shift and change as she accessed different aspects of the stored information. Marcus often found himself pausing outside her door, listening to the haunting melodies she sang as she worked. The music had become more complex over time, incorporating harmonics and rhythms that made the ship itself seem to resonate in sympathy. He had noticed that the Meridian's systems ran more smoothly when she was singing, as if her voice somehow harmonized with the ship's mechanical processes. Their destination was the Kepler system, the region of space where Kira's people had once lived. Marcus had initially been reluctant to undertake the journey, knowing that returning to the site of such devastation might be painful for her. But Kira had been insistent, making it clear through gestures and music that she needed to see what remained of her homeworld. The journey took them through several contested sectors, regions where the boundaries between legitimate government and frontier lawlessness blurred. Marcus's reputation as a neutral trader served them well, allowing them to pass through checkpoints and navigate political complexities that might have stopped other vessels. It was during one of these passages that they encountered their first serious threat. Marcus was reviewing navigation charts when the ship's proximity alarms began wailing. He rushed to the bridge to find 3 unmarked vessels moving to intercept them, their weapons systems already charging. "Unknown vessel, heave to for inspection," came the transmission, delivered in the clipped tones of professional pirates. "Comply immediately or face destruction." Marcus's hands moved quickly over the controls, assessing their options. The Meridian was fast but not particularly well armed, and running from 3 ships would be risky. However, surrendering to pirates could be equally dangerous, especially with Kira aboard. "Marcus," the voice came from behind him, and he turned to find Kira standing in the bridge doorway. She had pushed back her hood, revealing her silver eyes and the gills that fluttered along her neck. "Let me help." Before Marcus could respond, Kira moved to the ship's communication console. She began to sing, her voice carrying through the ship's speakers and out into space. The melody was unlike anything Marcus had heard from her before, complex, layered, and somehow commanding. The effect was immediate and startling. The 3 pirate vessels suddenly broke formation, their weapon systems powering down. Marcus watched in amazement as the ships began to drift apart, their crews apparently struggling with some kind of system malfunction. "What did you do?" Marcus asked quietly. Kira's silver eyes met his, and she made a gesture that seemed to indicate harmony disrupted and then restored. Somehow, her voice had interfaced with the attacking ship's systems, creating a resonance that had overwhelmed their electronics. "Unknown vessel," came a confused transmission from the lead pirate ship. "We're experiencing technical difficulties. Continue on your course." Marcus didn't need to be told twice. He engaged the ship's maximum acceleration, putting distance between them and the confused pirates. As they moved away, he could see the 3 vessels still drifting, their crews presumably trying to figure out what had happened to their systems. "Your people weren't just engineers," Marcus said as they reached safe distance. "They were warriors too." Kira nodded gravely, then made a gesture that seemed to indicate reluctant necessity. Her musical response was tinged with sadness, suggesting that her people had been peaceful by nature, but capable of defending themselves when required. The encounter changed something fundamental in their relationship. Marcus had always known that Kira was intelligent and capable, but he had underestimated the true extent of her abilities. She wasn't just a refugee from a destroyed civilization. She was a repository of knowledge and power that could be incredibly dangerous in the wrong hands. As they continued toward the Kepler system, Marcus found himself thinking about the implications of what he had witnessed. If Kira could disable 3 ships with her voice alone, what other capabilities did she possess? And what would happen if others discovered her true nature? The answer to that question came sooner than he expected. They were still 2 days out from the Kepler system when they received a priority transmission from Freeport Station. Victor Reeves's face